Just to summarize what has happened here, I tried to run the program without passing any arguments. Yet my program wants to access the first element in the args array, but if I don't pass any parameters, the args array is going to be empty. One of the responsibilities of the .NET runtime is to make sure that my program doesn't do anything that is obviously wrong. Trying to access a non-existent element inside of an array is something that is obviously wrong. So the .NET runtime will force my program to throw an exception. An exception represents an error condition. Later in this course, we're going to talk about exceptions in more detail. One of two things can happen when the runtime throws an exception. Either my program can handle the exception and say, yes, I expected this error to occur, or the exception goes unhandled, in which case it's going to halt the process or crash my process. The .NET runtime is not going to allow a program to continue executing if there's an unhandled exception, which is good because my program might be in a faulty state. It's operating under some erroneous condition. And if we just let it continue, it could do something terrible like just format my hard drive. So the program is halted because of an error, and now I need to figure out why. When you're first learning the C# language, it can be very difficult just to stare at lines of code and figure out where a problem is. And that's why a debugger can be useful. A debugger can allow me to execute my program in a controlled environment and inspect the environment as I go along to try to find the source of a problem. So let me show you how to use the debugger. This can be invaluable as you're learning the C# language. So first of all, I want to look at this error very closely, and I want to especially pay attention when the .NET runtime tells me the line of code where this error occurred. So I can see this is in program.cs line 9. So coming back to the editor, this is line 9, and what I want to do here is set a breakpoint on this line. So over here to the left of the line number, where the little red dot appears, I want to click to make that dot appear less transparent. And that tells me I have a breakpoint set on this line of code. So now when I run the program with a debugger attached, anytime execution reaches this line of code, line 9 on program.cs, the debugger is going to pause the program and allow me to inspect the environment. So I can look at things like the parameters array. I can look at variables. I can see what's defined and what the values are. So let's go ahead and try this. I'm going to click on debug, and I want to start with debugging. That would be the F5 key if I just wanted to hit a keyboard shortcut. This is going to launch my program. So my program is now executing. I can see some log messages scroll by down here in the debug console. And I know I have hit my breakpoint because I now have a yellow background on line 9 of program.cs. Of course, these colors can change depending on your color scheme. But code is clearly trying to highlight this line of code as where I have paused execution. And if I know this line of code is throwing an exception, well, one of the first things I should look at is, what are the arguments? Because I'm trying to access arg sub 0, the first element of that array. And this syntax that is appearing here when I hover over arg sub 0 is trying to tell me that args is a string array and it has a length of 0. And that means trying to access any element in this array is going to cause a problem. Another place to see variable values would be over here on the left-hand side. Here's a list of all the variables that are in scope and in effect when I hit this line of code. So that's another place where I could see that args is a string array of length 0, so I should not be able to access any elements there. And now I know what's wrong with the program. It's trying to access an element that doesn't exist. What can I do? Well, if I wanted to just go in and start fixing code, I could click up here on this toolbar to stop debugging, so Shift F5. That also happens from the debug menu. I can say stop debugging. However, as we move throughout this course, we're going to be writing more and more code, and you might have multiple breakpoints inside of a program, and you might want to do things like continue execution. So if I press F5, the debugger would allow my program to keep running until it hits another breakpoint. I can also step through lines of code. I can step over and I can step into. That would be the difference between entering a method and just stepping over a method. We'll talk more about that later in the course. But if I wanted to move to the next line of code in this program, I could press F10 to step over, but I can see, oh, I'm not allowed to get to the next line of code. I have a index out of range exception. An index was outside the bounds of the array. And actually, the debugger has halted my program where this exception has occurred, which again is line 9 of program.cs. So I sort of know what I have to fix. I have to make sure that someone has passed arguments to my program before I try to use those arguments. What my program should be doing is make sure that there is an element in the arguments array before it tries to use it. And a way to do that is to walk up to the arguments and check a property named length. So every array inside of .NET will have a length property. And the way I access a property in C# is to use the dot operator, is what we call it. So I want to go up to this arguments array and then inspect a length property, and that's going to give me back a value. A value like 0 would indicate an empty array. A value greater than 0 would say, yes, there is something in this array. So let's write our first simple if-else statement in C#. I want to use the keyword if, and inside of parentheses, I'm going to use an expression if args.length is greater than 0, then yes, I have something in this array. In which case I want to execute the next line of code, which is console.writeLine, hello, and then the argument. And in order to place this console.writeLine inside of this if statement, so anytime it is true, I'm going to wrap that statement with curly brackets. So we'll talk in more detail later in the course about if statements and other conditional statements, but I need to say if and then have some Boolean expression that returns true or false. If this expression returns true, I execute what is inside of the curly braces here, and I can also optionally have an else. So what if that if statement returns false? What if length is not greater than 0? In that case, let's do a console.writeLine and just give a generic hello greeting. And now to see if my program works, let me go back to the debug menu or press F5 or even Control F5 to say, let's just execute this program. I don't need the debugger. And down here in the debug console, I can see the output hello, which is perfect. Now my program doesn't crash when someone doesn't pass it parameters. But the question is, how do I pass this program parameters now? Well, from the command line, it's very easy. Now I should be able to say .NET run and pass in the command line parameter Alan, and I get back hello Alan, which is perfect. And if I pass in Scott, I get hello Scott. And if I don't pass any parameters, I just get a hello. So my program is working well. But when I run with the debugger, how do I pass in those parameters? Well, you might remember earlier in this module, when I received the notification in Visual Studio Code that required assets were not present to build and debug this project, do I want to add them? And I clicked yes. There were a few important files that were added to the file system. So coming back to the Explorer view here in Visual Studio Code, the files that I want to look at were created inside of a new folder with a .vs code name. So I want to open up that folder, and I can see there's 2 JSON files inside, and these JSON files control what Visual Studio Code will do when I want to do something like debug or build my project. Let me open up launch.json, and there's a lot of information inside of here that we don't care about. I just want to call your attention to, in this configuration section, this arguments array. So these are literally the arguments that the debugger will pass to my application when it launches it under the debugger, or even when I launch the program without the debugger. So in other words, let's pass Scott inside of here, and let me press Control F5 to run the application without the debugger, and I should be able to get hello Scott out when I run without the debugger. But now let's try something else interesting. Let's actually pass 2 arguments, Scott and Alan. This would be from the command line like sing -- Scott and Alan. But in this case, I'm going to do this with the debugger. And I want to do this, and I want to press F5 to run with the debugger. And I'm doing that just because I want to show you what the args will look like when you do have a parameter. Now when I mouse over this, I can see args sub 0 is Scott, and args sub 1 is Alan. So yes, these arguments will have a length. If I hover over length, I can see the length is 2. And that means I can use arg sub 0 and arg sub 1 legally without getting an exception. So this is the type of information that you can look at with a debugger. It can be extremely helpful when you're trying to figure out why your program is not behaving the way you expected. Is there some value in an array that you expected to be there that isn't there? Those are the types of things that you can look at with a debugger, and I encourage you to explore and experiment with this debugging tool before you move into the next module.